In a gleaming Manhattan tower, surrounded by the nation's top physicians, a billionaire's heartbeat was fading to a flatline, and they had all given up hope. The board of directors stood frozen in the hallway, their faces pale with the realization that a corporate empire was about to crumble. The medical team inside the room had just delivered the grim news. Less than an hour remained. Then, cutting through the tension like a knife, the elevator doors slid open. A man in a weathered jacket stepped out, his small daughter holding his hand, clutching a tattered teddy bear with one missing eye. The doctors in the room barely glanced up. They saw the scuffed boots, the tired coat, the small-town demeanor. They exchanged smirks. A country doctor. A nobody from some forgotten backwater. One of them whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Who let the janitor in?" 37 minutes later, that same man would command a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Sometimes the only cure for arrogance is a quiet man who knows exactly what he's doing. But to understand how he got there, you have to start 6 years earlier, in a place that had almost forgotten what a doctor looked like. Stay with me, because the real reason this single father walked away from a brilliant career is more shocking than the rescue itself. The town of Caldwell, Georgia, had a population of just over 4,000, one traffic light that was always blinking yellow, and a single doctor's office. That doctor was Marcus Dean. His clinic was a converted hardware store on Main Street, a building that still smelled faintly of sawdust and fertilizer. The floorboards groaned under the weight of anyone who walked on them. The waiting room held half a dozen mismatched chairs and a tiny television that got 3 channels clearly, and a 4th one if you held the antenna just right. Marcus had been there for 6 years. He hadn't intended to stay, not even close. He'd just driven until the highway shrank to a 2-lane road, then to gravel, and finally stopped at a town so small he was certain no one there had ever heard of the man he used to be. One Tuesday morning, he was taking blood pressure readings from his regular Dale Pewitt, a 61-year-old carpenter with high blood pressure and no health insurance. Dale came in every 3 weeks like clockwork. "Doc," Dale said, leaning back in the squeaky chair. "A man with hands like yours could be making a fortune in the city. What's keeping you in this one-horse town?" Marcus jotted down the numbers on the chart without looking up. "There's a different way to measure the value of things, Dale." In the corner, Marcus's daughter Zoe was perched cross-legged on a chair, a tattered workbook open on her knees. Her loyal stuffed bear Patch was tucked under her arm. She was 7 years old, with her father's same watchful, patient eyes. The older patients adored her. They often brought her hard candies from their purses. What the people of Caldwell didn't fully grasp was the sheer weight of the secret Marcus Dean was carrying. They just knew he was brilliant. They'd seen him handle terrifying emergencies with a bizarre calm, a construction worker who'd nearly severed his fingers, a rancher's wife suffering cardiac arrest in her kitchen, a teenager who flipped an ATV at high speed. Each time, Marcus moved with a precision that was almost unsettling. A calm that didn't come from indifference, but from a mastery so complete it was like breathing. But there was another thing the people of Caldwell noticed, something most of them were too polite to voice. Marcus Dean was the only black physician for 60 miles in any direction. Some new patients would walk in, take one look at the man behind the desk, and hesitate at the door. A few would leave and never return. Nobody ever said a word directly. Marcus noticed it all, filing it away with the quiet, unshakable patience of a man who had been dealing with that particular silence his entire professional life. He'd learned long ago that reacting changed nothing, only the work changed things. The little television in the waiting room cut to a breaking news alert just past noon. A sleek glass and steel conference room in New York City appeared on the screen. A woman in a sharp suit had collapsed mid-sentence during a global press event. The anchor's voice was urgent. The woman was Catherine Vance, the CEO of Vance Biotech. She was being rushed to Meridian Medical Center. Their elite cardiac team was assembling, and her prognosis was critical. Marcus had stopped writing mid-sentence. His eyes were fixed on the screen, not on the woman, but on the monitor visible in the background for just a second before the camera cut away. He saw a glimpse of her heart rhythm. 3 seconds, that was all he needed. Zoe looked up from her workbook. "Dad, do you know her?" He looked at his daughter, then back at the flickering screen. "No," he said softly. His phone buzzed on the desk, a New York area code. He stared at it for a moment, then turned it face down without answering. Marcus Dean was 34 when he performed his first solo cardiac surgery at Meridian Medical Center. The whole department had gathered to watch, not because a surgeon his age doing a solo operation was a rarity, but because of the sheer, hypnotic economy of his movements. Every physician in the room recognized it, the unwavering certainty, the sense that he'd already played out every possible complication 1,000 times in his head. True mastery isn't about showing off, it's about making the impossible look effortless. A senior attending later confided to a colleague that watching Marcus operate was like watching a person do the exact thing they were born to do. The colleague nodded, but glanced over his shoulder first. That small, nervous gesture told Marcus everything he needed to know about the building he was in. By 36, he'd operated on a sitting senator, been profiled in a major medical journal, and turned down offers from 2 top European hospitals. He turned them all down because of Grace. Grace Dean was a 4th-grade teacher in Brooklyn with a laugh that could fill a room. She'd met Marcus at a farmer's market, arguing with him within 10 minutes about how to choose the perfect peach. He hadn't stopped smiling since. They were married 14 months later. She was the best thing that ever happened to him. He knew he didn't tell her that nearly often enough. Zoe was born when Grace was 29. They'd just bought an apartment in Park Slope. Life felt luminous, the kind of perfect that usually comes right before it all shatters. Grace was admitted to Meridian on a Tuesday in November. A routine procedure. Simple, 2 hours tops. She never came home. Marcus, unable to accept the ambiguity, launched his own quiet investigation. Over 3 months he pieced together a horrifying truth: a hospital procurement agreement. A cheap, unapproved compound substituted into the anesthesia protocol. It wasn't negligence, it was arithmetic. The signature on the authorization was Dr. Shelton Grave, Chief of Cardiovascular Medicine, Marcus's direct supervisor for 4 years. The same man who'd interrupted him in meetings, delayed his cases, and once in front of a full room said with careful, rehearsed neutrality, "We need to ensure all decisions in this department are properly verified." Marcus brought the evidence to the hospital board. Grave was there. The board deliberated for 11 days and returned a verdict of insufficient grounds. Marcus sat in that room and looked at each face. He understood instantly. The evidence was solid, airtight, but evidence exists inside systems, and systems are built by people. And the people in that room had collectively decided that it was easier to believe Shelton Grave than it was to believe Marcus Dean. He stood up, thanked them in a voice that betrayed nothing, and walked out. He packed 2 bags, one for himself and one for Zoe, who was 3 years old and asleep in her crib. He drove until the road didn't make sense anymore. He turned south. He stopped in Caldwell, Georgia, because a woman at a gas station told him they hadn't seen a doctor in 40 miles for 2 years. He stayed. The night Catherine Vance collapsed, Marcus sat in the kitchen of his rented house on Elm Street, a photo of Grace on the table in front of him. Her face, frozen at 29, laughing at something just out of frame. He looked at that photo the way a man checks a map, not because he doubts his destination, but because he needs to be reminded the world still contains that fixed point. His phone had buzzed 6 more times. He hadn't touched it. He sat with the silence of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a tree branch against the window, the familiar sounds of a life he'd deliberately made small. Then a text arrived from Evelyn Okafor, a nurse he'd worked with at Meridian, a woman with 31 years of experience. She'd been in the room the only other time Marcus had seen a heart do what Catherine Vance's was doing. She wrote, "She'll be gone by dawn if you don't act. No one else can help." Evelyn. Marcus read it once, then a second time. He set the phone down beside the photograph and stared at both of them. For a long while, he sat with the weight of holding a specific piece of knowledge that no one else in the world possessed. The arrhythmia pattern he'd seen for 3 seconds on that TV wasn't standard. It was the signature of a congenital structural anomaly, so rare it existed only as a footnote in medical literature, not as a diagnostic category. He'd encountered it exactly once, 8 years ago, in an unrecorded procedure where only 2 others had been present. One retired in Arizona, and the other, Evelyn, was texting him from a Manhattan hospital corridor. He was the only person alive who knew the specific sequence of interventions required. He'd known it from those 3 seconds of footage. He'd known it the moment he turned his phone over. He was sitting with the knowledge the way a man sits with a decision he's already made, but hasn't yet found the courage to speak aloud. He stood. He walked to the hook by the door and lifted his old coat. He held it for a moment without putting it on. Then he put it on. They left Caldwell at 11:15 at night. Marcus's truck was old, carrying a single duffel bag and Zoe's backpack, which held her schoolbooks, 2 granola bars, and Patch, the one-eyed bear. Zoe had been awake when he came to get her. She hadn't asked a single question. She'd simply climbed out of bed, put her shoes on the wrong feet, silently switched them, and followed him to the truck. The first 2 hours passed in a heavy, comfortable silence. The highway stretched out, dark and steady, mile markers blinking by like a slow, hypnotic countdown. Somewhere past the South Carolina border, Zoe turned her head from the window. "Dad," she said, her voice small in the dark. "Why do they call you a country doctor?" Marcus thought about it for a moment. "Because they've never seen me work, Zoe." She considered this with the same profound gravity she brought to everything that mattered. "Is that because you left the big hospital?" "That's part of it." She was quiet again, the dark silhouette of pine trees rushing past the window. "Were you really good before?" He glanced at her, the dashboard light caught her profile. For just a split second she looked so much like Grace that his chest tightened unexpectedly. "Yes," he said, "I was. Are you still?" He stared at the road, watching a water tower slide past in the darkness. "I suppose we're about to find out." She seemed satisfied with that answer. She turned back to the window, and within 20 minutes she was asleep, her head drifting toward his shoulder until it rested there, warm and heavy. He drove with one hand on the wheel, her weight against his arm, and thought about Grace. He thought about the last time he'd driven toward New York instead of away from it, and all the miles between those two versions of the same road. They stopped for gas in North Carolina at 3:00 a.m. Marcus stood under the harsh white lights of the truck stop, a styrofoam cup of terrible coffee in his hand, watching the other cars roll through. Nobody looked at him, nobody knew who he was. 6 years ago, that anonymity had been the only thing he wanted. The relief of existing outside the reach of his own history. Now he wasn't so sure. Something had shifted on the highway, somewhere past the Georgia line. He finished the coffee, tossed the cup, and got back in the truck. Meridian Medical Center rose 40 floors above 57th Street, a monolith of glass and pale stone, designed to project an aura of infallibility. Its lobby was polished marble, corporate art, and the quiet, efficient movement of people wearing their credentials like armor. Marcus walked through the main entrance at 7:14 a.m. His coat was weathered, his boots still carried the grime from the truck stop, and he hadn't shaved since Sunday. He carried nothing that announced his presence. The woman at the front desk looked up. Her eyes scanned his face, then his jacket, then dropped to Zoe standing beside him, clutching her backpack and her beloved Patchy Bear. The woman's hands hovered above her keyboard. Her pause lasted just 2 seconds longer than necessary. Evelyn Okafor was waiting by the elevator bank. She was a small, silver-haired woman in her mid-60s, her face a mask of calm competence. She looked at Marcus without preamble. "You came. Tell me everything," he said. She briefed him as they walked, giving him the cardiac profile, the reactions to the implant, the failed interventions from the past 16 hours. Each one had made Catherine Vance worse. Evelyn delivered the facts with the precision of a seasoned veteran who had long ago lost patience for ego. The conference room on the 6th floor was a war room. 12 physicians sat around a long table covered in charts and printouts, the wreckage of a sleepless night. At the head stood Shelton Grave. He was broader now, older, with the smug authority of a man who hadn't been challenged in a decade. He looked at Marcus as Evelyn opened the door. His eyes traveled slowly, deliberately from Marcus's face, to his jacket, to his boots, to Zoe in the doorway. He didn't look amused, he looked offended. "You drove all night to play the hero." Grave's voice was measured, almost pleasant. A physician near the center of the table leaned toward his colleague, not quiet enough. "This is the guy they're bringing in, a doctor from the sticks." No one corrected him. Marcus didn't respond. He walked to the table, picked up the nearest chart and started reading. The room watched in tense silence. Some faces held open skepticism. Others showed a guarded curiosity, people who'd been told to dismiss him but weren't entirely sure they should. He read for 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system. He set the chart down. "You're killing her." His voice was level, no emotion. "The arrhythmia isn't the primary event. It's a reaction cascade triggered by the implant interacting with her structural anomaly. Every intervention you've tried in the last 16 hours has made it worse. If you continue this protocol, she won't survive the next procedure." Grave's jaw tightened. "You have no standing here." You're a backwards doctor from Georgia. You haven't been on a real floor in 6 years. Before Grav could finish, an alarm shrieked from down the hall. Room 7. Catherine Vance's heart had stopped. The corridor filled with staff in seconds, residents, nurses, senior physicians moving with urgent practice strides. Grav was 2 steps ahead of Marcus, already barking orders. Marcus moved past him, not aggressively, not even quickly. He simply flowed through the crowd with the fluid, unobstructed purpose of a person who has never needed to announce his arrival. And the crowd at the doorway parted for him, instinctively, because his certainty was unmistakable. Inside, Catherine lay against the monitors, her face grey, her lips slightly parted. Her heart had been stopped for 41 seconds. He doesn't have privileges here, someone shouted from the doorway, their voice caught between protocol and panic. She's dying, Marcus said, not as an argument but as fact. He pulled on gloves and looked at Evelyn, who was already at the supply cabinet, already anticipating his sequence. She'd been waiting for this moment for 8 years. Let's move, he said. What happened over the next 9 minutes was, to the witnesses, almost impossible to describe later. It wasn't visually dramatic. There were no raised voices. Marcus moved through a sequence none of them had ever seen, a precise combination of pharmacological intervention and manual technique that addressed the underlying cascade, stabilizing the rhythm at its source rather than trying to force the heart back with brute force. He narrated as he worked, quietly and continuously, not for the room, but for Evelyn, who followed every instruction without hesitation, who had waited 8 years to put this knowledge to use. The room went still. The physicians at the edges, the ones who had smirked and whispered, had fallen silent. They weren't just watching, they were recognizing something. A gap between what he was doing and what they could do, a gap so vast it was humbling. Grav stood at the edge of the room. His arms hung at his sides. You're going to induce secondary arrest, he said as Marcus reached a crucial point. If you complete that sequence, the ventricle will. I know exactly what the ventricle will do, Marcus said without looking up. I've done this before, a beat of silence. Have you? Grav asked. Evelyn looked across the room at Grav. She said nothing, but her eyes held a lifetime of knowledge. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Grav looked away first. The monitor shifted its tone. The alarm didn't stop all at once. It stepped down 1 register at a time, like a thing slowly being talked out of a fight. Catherine Vance's heart found its rhythm, held it again. The room was completely silent. Marcus removed his gloves, set them on the tray with the same unhurried precision, and walked out. He didn't wait for anyone to speak. He sat down in the nearest chair in the hallway, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and just sat there. The fluorescent lights buzzed their steady, indifferent hum. Evelyn came out a few minutes later with a paper cup of coffee. She sat beside him and offered it. Neither spoke for a long time. Are you okay? She finally asked. Ask me later, he said. She nodded. She understood that answer. She'd heard it once before, 6 years ago. It wasn't an evasion, it was a promise. Grav never came into the hallway. Marcus saw him through the glass panel of the conference room, standing with his back to the corridor, looking at something in his hands. Whatever he was feeling, he kept it locked away. Evelyn had arranged for Zoe to wait in a small family room down the hall. A volunteer had given her a juice box. Zoe was deep in a book when Marcus appeared in the doorway. She looked up, studied his face with the calm efficiency she'd developed from a lifetime of watching him, and said, "You saved her, didn't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," he said. She seemed to confirm the reading and went back to her book. He sat down beside her, and they stayed there in the quiet. Catherine Vance refused to wear a hospital gown. This was the first thing the nurses told Marcus when they said she wanted to speak with him. She'd insisted on her own clothes, had her laptop brought in, and was taking calls from her legal team within hours of being stabilized. When Marcus entered her recovery suite, she was sitting up, pale hair pulled back severely, her eyes sharp and assessing. She studied him for a long, silent moment. "I read your file before I asked Evelyn to contact you," she said. Marcus sat down. "Which file?" "Not the medical one, the other one." She paused. "The documentation you compiled about your wife." "I needed to know who I was asking for help." The room went quiet. Outside the window the city churned on. "Then you know what happened to Grace?" "I know exactly what happened to her," Catherine said. "And I know whose signature was on the authorization." Grav. "He's still here." She said nothing, just nodded. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Because you deserve to know that someone outside that boardroom believed you," she said. "And because I want to offer you something." She set her phone down. Not a title, not a position. I want to fund a cardiac care center, sliding scale, community-based, not in a tower built for the people who have been forced to navigate a system that treats access like a privilege. I want you to run it." Marcus looked at his hands. "Why? Not because you're the best cardiac surgeon I could find, though you are," she said, "but because you're the only person I've met who remembers why the work exists in the first place." He moved to the window, looking out at the traffic, the pedestrians. He thought about Grace. He thought about Coldwell, about Dale Pewett's blood pressure, about the afternoon light coming through the hardware store windows, the particular texture of a place where he'd become necessary again. "I'll think about it," he said. It was the most honest thing he could offer. Before he left, Evelyn caught him near the elevators. She pressed a sealed envelope into his hand. "What is this?" "The original documentation with the verification stamp, the one the board told you didn't exist. I've had it since the year after Grace died." She paused. "I was waiting for the right moment. I think it's now." Marcus held the envelope. He didn't open it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a very old door finally swinging open on its own weight, a door he'd convinced himself he no longer needed to walk through. He tucked it into his jacket, close to his chest. He found Zoe asleep in the chair, patch on her chest, her book open on her knee. He let her sleep for a few minutes. He thought about her question on the drive. "Are you still good?" He'd always been good, even when the system failed him. The goodness hadn't been contingent on the audience. It never had been. 1 year later, the Dean Vance Cardiac Care Center opened in a renovated building in a transitional neighborhood, between a laundromat and a community garden, 2 blocks from a public school. It operated on a sliding scale so aggressive that for many patients it was effectively free. Catherine Vance had restructured 3 divisions of her company to fund it. Her communications team warned it might scare investors. She published the announcement without modification. Her company's valuation increased. More people, it seemed, trusted integrity over optics. The investigation into Shelton Grave began 11 months after Evelyn filed her documentation. Marcus learned about it via a terse email, subject line blank. He read it twice, set his phone down and stared out his office window. It wasn't triumph he felt, but something quieter, the sensation of a weight he'd carried so